to use the chat box and introduce yourself and tell us where you are watching from. And we'll get started here in just a moment discussing the book, Dignity in Policing. And what a great opportunity we've got before us today. And so welcome, Phil from Kansas. Glad you're here. And I know we've got a lot of people from around the country that are joining us today. Hello, Will from Addison, just here in Dallas, Lynette in Houston, Julie in Fort Worth. Welcome to all of you. And let's get started because I want to make sure we're making the most of our time today. I have with me today the authors of the book, Dignity in Policing, Marcel Brunel and Dan Newby. And Marcel and I have been friends for a number of years now, and we kind of operate in the same space of facilitation a lot with local governments. Marcel more specifically most of the time with police departments and public safety. But we've become friends, and I have had the opportunity to read this book and teach this book, and so excited about having Marcel and Dan with us today. So Marcel, with that, introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go to Dan and let Dan do the same.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Mike, for the opportunity, and thank you, SGR, for the platform. Marcel Brunel, born in California, raised in Ohio. Then I went to high school in Houston, joined the Army, got out, went to college here in Texas. And in 2014, I was working with a city here in Texas, and it changed the trajectory of my focus. So I used to only work with corporations. And after I worked with the city staff and the city council, then it really hit me. According to the police chief, I should be working with police departments. And in 2014, I started working with police departments around different types of measurements of them under stress. And today I live in Farmers Branch, which is right next to Will, who lives in Addison, Texas, on this call. So shout out to Will in Addison. And I currently work with 104 policing agencies across the country. And so again, very passionate around the measurement of emotions. And so looking forward to the conversation.
All right. Well, very good. We'll get into that in just a minute. Dan, we want to welcome you as well. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Happy to be here. Well, I have lived in many parts of the world, too many to mention. I currently live in Spain, although today I'm calling in from Fort Collins, Colorado, at my son's house. But my work is all in the area of emotions, and emotions as a practical tool, as a skill. So not emotional intelligence, but I work with emotional regulation, emotional literacy. And I work with people of all backgrounds. So I've worked with educators, leaders, I've worked with therapists, I've worked with faith leaders, I've worked with parents, really anybody who is interested in learning about how do we develop, understand, and use emotions as a tool to improve our lives. So I teach courses, and Marcel came to one of my courses, and he just kept coming back and kept coming back. And he said, you know what, this stuff dovetails so well that we should be in a conversation. So we started a conversation. We ended up with a book.
Yeah. It's a great book. And I want to encourage, we'll put some information out throughout the webinar on how people can buy it. But really, you can just go to Amazon and put a search for Dignity in Policing, and you can get it. You can also, I know, listen to it on Spotify. So we'll kind of get into that a little bit later, let you guys talk about it. But give us a quick rundown on what caused the two of you to write this book. Why did you write this book, and what's it about?
Yeah. For the last 10 years, I've noticed that there's a lot of perceptions around policing and a lot of perceptions around emotions. And there's a big, huge need for more mental wellness, and emotional wellness fits under there. And so that was one reason. There seems to be new research, new data coming out around emotions being helpful at home, at work, and also too in life. And so what Dan and I were thinking was, how can we create a way for humans to see there's two spheres that we have. We have our intellectual sphere and we have our emotional sphere. And a lot of times at work, we get very good learning and development around the intellectual sphere. And rarely, seldom, never do we get any development around the emotional sphere. And yet, the actions that sometimes humans take are around, intellectual, but they're always also too around that emotional side. So competent as well as emotionally fit, those are the actions. That's really what we're trying to ensure gets a good platform, gets a fair shake. When we do what we do, emotions run strong, opinions vary, and the stakes get high. There is an intellectual way to kind of de-escalate. There's also an emotional way to de-escalate. So
Mhm.
it's kind of a nice combination. Dan?
Yeah, lovely. Well, this all started as a personal quest years ago that I discovered that the root of many of my issues in life was I was emotionally ignorant. So I thought, well, I'm going to build this. I'm going to learn about this. So ever since then, my goal, my aim, my vision is creating a world where people are emotionally literate, where they have access to their emotions, they can leverage their emotions. They quit seeing emotions as something to be embarrassed about. They just see it as part of being human. And so that's my work as a practitioner. And of course, like I said, I worked with lots of different people from different backgrounds. And so when I met Marcel, he proposed, writing a book about, okay, how do you apply the things you do in a police environment, in a law enforcement environment? And to be honest, I didn't know because I don't have any connection. I didn't have any background in policing or law enforcement. I've had a couple of traffic tickets and that's it. So for me, it was lovely because I got to think about and work with Marcel on articulating how does what I've always worked with apply in this environment. And for me, it's been a journey of learning. It's been fantastic. And then I always get Marcel's reports back and I get feedback from his clients in law enforcement. And that helps me better understand, well, what's relevant and what's not relevant. And so the journey continues into teaching courses and developing other tools for this environment and for a broader audience. So for me, it was a lovely opportunity with somebody I am delighted I get to work with to apply what I'd been working on for years to a completely new sector of society.
Yeah. Well, you talk about emotions in a very different way than most books I've read or approaches I've come across. And I want you guys to talk about that a little bit because you don't just talk about emotional intelligence, but we've got, you're looking at emotions in a different way and you're expanding our understanding of what emotional intelligence is. And that has application to all of us, but I want to talk about that, especially related to policing.
Okay.
So I don't care which one starts with that.
Okay. Well,
Jump into this because this is fascinating.
okay, let me start this one, Marcel. One of the
Absolutely.
things I've discovered in all of my years of personal learning and professional education and teaching is that we grew up, almost all of us, and I don't just mean in Texas, I mean globally, we as human beings grew up with some misinterpretations, some misapprehensions, or some myths about emotions. And when you really question those, you begin to see that, oh, well, maybe some of those things aren't as true as we were told they were. So, for instance, the idea that the best relationship we can have with emotions is to learn to control them. Well, I've been working in this area for a long time, and I can't control my emotions, and I don't know anybody who can. So that has me question the premise that, in fact, it's even possible. So I began thinking, well, but what relationship could we have? Well, we could learn to navigate our emotions. Maybe we can't control them. Maybe we can't even sometimes manage them very well, but we could learn to navigate them. And then when you begin thinking about that, it opens up lots of new possibilities. But the idea that there are inherently positive and negative emotions, I question. The idea that emotions don't have a purpose, that emotions get in the way of clear thinking, that, and on and on and on. There's about 10 of these myths that I cover in my work, and they're in the book, and Marcel uses them to have people look at the possibility of understanding emotions differently and seeing emotions as a life skill and as a tool and just part of who we are as human beings, rather than something to avoid, something to be embarrassed about, and something that gets in the way of living. It actually enhances living.
So this is a little bit contrary to the way a lot of police officers look at their job. And they would much more say, we have to separate our work from our emotions. We have to control our emotions, ignore those emotions. Marcel, what are some of those myths that you're dealing with in this book that you really want to call attention to for our law officers?
Well, I think the first thing that's very helpful to remember is there's an ironclad connection between the emotions you have and the level of policing that you're going to provide. Said differently, there's an ironclad connection between your emotions and how you show up for yourself or how you show up for your team. One of the things that we've learned is that sometimes you have two choices. I can push my emotions down. That is an option, to box them up. And that may be the smartest thing for you to do. It might be the right thing for you to do at that time. There's an emotion called dispassion. Dispassion allows you to do just that, move from a lens of logic and something more intellectual and not so emotional, but you can't stay that way forever. Yeah. And so I could box up my emotions, or going back to what Dan said, I could navigate them. And they're both hard. That's the deal. Boxing up your emotions is hard. Navigating your emotions is hard. What Dan and Marcel are promoting is pick your heart. Research shows, every piece of research shows it's not the amount of traumatic experiences that people have that decides what life is going to be like when they retire. It's how they navigate those traumatic experiences as they go through life to get to when they retire. So one of the things Dan and I are looking at is how are we navigating our emotions daily, and what will life be like when I navigate my emotions when I retire? Almost everybody I work with inside of a municipality or an agency is financially ready to retire. What Dan and Marcel want to make sure is, are we emotionally ready to retire? To be ready to be around people who are with us at that time. We wrote a couple pages in the book about, because sometimes I'll have officers walk up and say, I've only got 2 years left in my career. This can be anybody. And they're like, I don't need emotions right now. And you go, well, let's take a look and see what emotions you're going to have when you retire, when your purpose is gone, and now all you're left with is your decisions you made, the problems you solved, and the relationships that maybe you built or didn't build. So those are the things that we're looking at both daily and then also too, Mike, long term.
Yeah, it's both, because we all know situations where somebody is great at their job. They're great, but the trauma and the ongoing ways that they're dealing with it is making them not great at home,
Mhm.
not great to themselves. And we want better for them than that. And they deserve it. You know, people that serve our cities in public law enforcement, we should honor them. We need them. But we don't want to do that at the expense of the quality of their lives, right? They deserve to be able to handle this better. And that's what this book I see helps them do, is like, okay, there's things I can't control, but how do I work with those emotions? You guys talk about different things, and I want you to kind of dive into what's the difference between emotional intelligence emotional literacy, emotional agility, and emotional resilience. Walk us through the differences, because for a lot of us, it's one big thing, but you help us see it in a different way.
Dan, you want to go first or you want me to lead?
No, I think you take this one. So.
If someone came up to me and said, "Hey, what's emotional intelligence?" I'd say it's our native emotional capacity. Everybody has emotional intelligence. So that's one thing, but it's our some of our learning to date around emotions. And so sometimes people will take an assessment and they will get an emotional intelligence score, or it lets them see their blind spots that could be causing blind behaviors. Like someone says, "Oh my gosh, I'm not that empathetic," or "I'm not that compassionate," or "maybe I need to be a lot less on the argumentative side," or whatever. That's emotional intelligence. Do I have any intelligence at all about my emotions, self, others? And then also to intentionality, how am I showing up? Different, very different. Now, let's say my emotional assessment says that Marcel doesn't really display naturally compassion. Emotional literacy, see, now that's where I go to get better with that emotion. Emotional intelligence says, here might be what you dial up and dial back. Emotional literacy says, "Hey, Marcel, how good are you at noticing your emotions? There's over 200 of them. So if I don't know the difference between optimism and hope or guilt and shame, then I'm only going to maybe have about 27. So can I notice? But then can I also name them? And can I help, like Dan said, navigate them?" That's the ability for me as a human to get better over time. Now, the last thing we got to think about is emotional regulation. I mean, emotional resilience is your bounce back. That's forward and back. Hey, you didn't get promoted. Can you bounce back? Daughter didn't make it into college she wanted to get into. Can you bounce back? Got divorced. Can you bounce back? Agility is side to side. So resilience is going through hard times. And we're finding that a very awesome emotion to help you be more resilient is optimism. Another good emotion to keep you more resilient is perseverance. So emotions play in these specific arenas. And then the last one is agility side to side. Think of a football player, think of a gymnast, being able to be more agile. As I'm looking at my emotion of anxiety, can I flex? Can I navigate to another more helpful emotion side to side? I don't trust anyone. Okay, I can trust a few people. So that's what I would say would be how they're similar to and how they're different from.
And
Okay, Dan.
what we propose in the book,
Here.
which is if you add all of those up, we all have emotional intelligence. There's nobody without that. We can learn through emotional literacy. We can build our emotional literacy. We can practice and develop the agility and resilience. But when you put all of those together, you get what we're all looking for, which is the ability to regulate emotionally. Emotional regulation, meaning I have choice. I can be angry when anger serves me, but I won't be angry when it doesn't serve me, or I won't display it. And so emotional regulation is what I think we're all going for. And if we think about the other domain, the intellect, what did you do when you were young? You took an IQ test. And what was that for? Well, it was to measure or assess your intellectual capacity. And then you went to school. And what did they do at school? They taught you the letters, they taught you to read and write. You developed linguistic literacy. And the magic of that is it helps you access your IQ or your intelligence, but it also is the tool that helps you build it or enhance it. And with emotions, it's exactly the same. What we're proposing is we all have the native EQ or emotional intelligence. If we focus on our emotional learning, then you have the tools you need to both access what's already there and to augment it.
Yeah.
That's what we see. That's our work.
So important because, we often sort of self-congratulate ourselves if we've had one of those assessments, Marcel, and we know, oh, well, I'm not good at this, I'm not good at that. All right, well, that's great, but all you've really done is measure
Mm-hmm.
where you're at now.
Mm-hmm.
You haven't, just by knowing that, developed the capacity to get better at it. And I think this is one of the really cool things in the book is you give us hope that wherever we are in emotional intelligence, we can get better. And
Mm-hmm.
here's how:
Absolutely.
through literacy, emotional literacy, learning how to have emotional resilience and emotional agility, which all added up is regulation. So, what have been some of the pushback or some of the responses? Let's say that. What's some of the responses you've had, positive and negative, as you've taught this book or talked about it and shared this? Either one of you.
Well, here's what we did, Mike. When we first started writing, there's an expression that says you can only pet a porcupine one way. Yeah. And sometimes when people are very skeptical, and they're reading the book, you kind of want to make sure that every word counts. So what we did was every time we wrote a chapter, we had 57 different professional staff and sworn officers proof it, read it, tweak it, shine, polish. Hey, this word helps, but boy, oh boy, this word would be more influential. So every single chapter has a story, starts with a story written by a sworn officer. Then it has content proofed by 57 different employees from 17 different police departments across the country. After they read content, then the third thing they get inside the chapter is questions to ask yourself. Let's do some self-scouting. It's always good to do. And then the fourth thing it ends with, every chapter ends with practical application. What can only I do now that I know what I know? What could I do in application to life? What could I do to application to family? What can I do application to career? So what we're getting, the book came out in March of this year. The good news is we're not getting a lot of you shouldn't have said this or this. I'm not sure you actually meant to say that. What we are getting is part of the book at the very beginning. We had 25 different roles and ranks within a police department. So let's say animal services. We had somebody after we wrote the book read the book from animal services and they wrote a paragraph. Hey, I'm in animal services. If you're in animal services, here's how you might read the book. We had chief, assistant chief, we had supervisors, we had directors, we had lieutenants, majors, captains, all the way to and through SWAT, FTOs. So here's what happened, because we say the book is for everyone. Well, then we get an email. How come there's nobody in there from records? Okay, good point. How come there's nobody in there from code enforcement? So we just are now going into the second edition of the book,
Okay.
which will come out in December. And we now have code enforcement. We now have records. So everyone is being celebrated and everybody has some good chance to give some awesome contribution. So that's kind of where we are. Now, a couple of chiefs have said this book is very helpful in a promotional process, going from sergeant to lieutenant or from officer to sergeant. So some agencies are using it as a promotional book. Other agencies are rolling it out in every one of their academy classes because this is where we are in 2024. I need IQ in my officers and my professional staff, but I also need some emotional literacy. So that combination. So the good news is we did some really hard work and heavy lifting on the front end, which is allowing us to be more helpful on the back end.
So, Marcel, do you feel like what role do you feel like emotional regulation is going to play in the typical police officer's career? They're starting off. How important is this going to be to their ability to rise in the profession?
Well, let's work the other way real quick. I'm currently working with 4 police officers right now going through a divorce. And as they look at their emotions, you start to see that dispassion, the emotion that allows you to not have a lot of emotion and maybe miss some emotional cues and clues, allowed them to get divorced and not even see it coming.
Mm.
I'm currently working with 2 deputy chiefs in a major city. who want to become assistant chiefs, but they grew up with a line of thinking, which is correct and complete at the time, that says you got to be direct. I have to be direct and I have to have presence. And the city council wanted them to be more diplomatic. And so now I've come into my life thinking this has served me so well to deputy chief. And yet, sometimes if I don't stay ready, now I'm going to have to get ready. And so they have to get ready in front of city council because now they have to be more diplomatic, more maybe understanding, maybe a little bit more empathetic, sympathetic, maybe a little bit more compassionate. You pick. What we're seeing is everything works until it doesn't.
Mhm.
And in that environment right there, you're starting to see that emotions are the difference that can make the difference at home, at work, and then also too in your life. So that's kind of the way I would tee it up there, Mike, is you can't boss self-awareness. And Dan and Marcel are not in the convincing business. There's people who don't believe that what we're doing is that necessary. And guess what? Way okay with that. Dan?
Yeah. Well, I can't speak to it the way Marcel does, as within law enforcement and police agencies, but I can speak about it more globally, which is to say that with leaders, with educators, with principals, with superintendents, with everybody that I've ever worked with, their emotional learning, I would say, is key to both their satisfaction with life, but also their advancement if that's what they're looking for, to improve themselves both as a human being, but also professionally. So I would say that what we've written, we focused on law enforcement and policing, but the underpinnings apply to every human being I've ever worked with. So I don't, it's not something we made up just for this audience. It's something that comes from a broad background, many different cultures, many different parts of the world, is that if you think about what emotions do for you, well, one of the key things they do for you is they allow you to have relationships with
Mhm.
yourself, with other individuals, with teams, and even we would say with what's beyond human, with nature or a divinity. So what we see is that anybody who's in relationships, which we all are, benefits from their emotional learning because then they can design the emotions they want. They can resolve challenges within their emotions and they can connect more deeply with the people that they want to connect with. And it doesn't matter whether it's, a client, it doesn't matter whether it's your partner, your children, it doesn't matter if it's the clerk at the grocery store. It allows you to connect more deeply, more authentically, and more intentionally with every other human being.
Yeah, that's so good. In the book, you talk about several emotions, many, and you talk a little bit about how to dial this up and how to dial this back.
Mhm.
Walk us through that a little bit because I know we don't have time to get into all of them, but give everybody a taste of that because I thought
Yeah.
that was really awesome.
Marcel?
Let's go back to the title of the book, Dignity. So
Okay, yes.
by working with over 4,000 employees inside of police departments and agencies, we found that dignity, the emotion of dignity, number one emotion that allows policing to remain a noble profession. So how do I dial that up when I'm in front of dispatch? Sometimes when I work with dispatch, they don't feel the dignity. They don't feel worthy. They don't feel that self-respect. Sometimes when I work with animal services, they don't feel the dignity. They don't feel that I get to decide or I am worthy just by doing what I do. So I think when you think of dignity being dialed up, it doesn't cost any money. And yet, inside of an agency, that's what people want to feel. They want to have it for themselves and they want to be able to give it. What's one that we've learned can erode the nobility of a profession? Entitlement. And
Mm,
sometimes after 30 years, sometimes when you've been promised something and it didn't happen, or maybe you confuse serve with sacrifice and you've sacrificed everything, you've given everything up, even your family, you start to feel this emotion of entitlement, which says, hey, I deserve this. The agency owes me. I get to whine. And let me tell you what life would be like if I was the chief implementing this policy. So sometimes I got to dial that back.
Hmm.
Self-awareness is huge, but remember, just because you know doesn't mean you know how. And so knowing about emotions and knowing how, completely two different things. Dan?
What can I say? Ditto, ditto, ditto.
Yeah. I think this is where you help us start understanding emotions as a skill
Hmm.
we can get better at. And, you know, we can't divorce ourselves from emotions. There may be a point where we say, I can't deal with this emotion right now because this task is at hand, but at some point,
Hmm.
I've got to deal with it or it's going to deal with me.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so now we'll start wrapping it up. What's next? You have a couple of things. This is the end. So clue us in a little bit on what's coming next.
We got a couple phone calls, and somebody said, "Hey, my spouse, partner, loved one bought the book Dignity in Policing, but I'm not in policing. How about dignity in leadership?" So we took a note. And then somebody called and said, "How about dignity in education?" So we took a note. Then somebody said, "How about dignity in healthcare?" And we took a note. So in December, we will be coming out with our second book called Dignity in Leadership, which is very similar to what you would see inside of dignity policing, different from through the lens of maybe someone outside of a paramilitary type environment. The second thing that's coming down the pike is an emotional regulation assessment. We believe that self-awareness is pretty awesome. So we now can measure in one assessment your emotional intelligence, your emotional literacy, your emotional agility, and your emotional resilience, and give you an overall individual score of those, but an inclusive score of your emotional regulation. Not to judge, to allow you to see where you are in your journey. So that's the second thing. And then the third thing, just like you talked about, Mike, dial up, dial back. We've now created some Emore cards, emotional regulation cards, just like you learned your multiplication. This allows you to put names to better name the emotion so we can better navigate. And it has on the back ways to dial it up and ways to dial it down. Dan, anything else?
All I can say is every time Marcel and I talk, there's something new on the horizon. So
It's
that's
so
what
true.
that's what we know for now.
Yeah.
But as we're spreading this, as we're talking to people, what's fascinating is it is resonating incredibly strongly to the point where people are saying yes, and what would
Uh-huh.
really be lovely is X, Y, or Z, and we're game, right? We think it's wonderful because, for me, my goal in life, what I really care about is that everybody, I don't care who they are, is that they build their emotional literacy, because it's changed my life immeasurably. It's so much better. And I think that happens for everybody. It happens with every one of my clients. I think Marcel would say the same. And like Marcel said, it's free. Like, you've already got it. You just need to build a little bit of knowledge and you need to practice. And if you're willing to do that, it is available to you.
Yeah. Well, I want to say thank you so much, gentlemen. You've given us a great tool. One of the passions of my life is helping leaders get better wherever they are in the organization, whatever their age, whatever their deal. We can get better at leading. And when leaders get better, everyone gets better. And emotional regulation is a big part of this. And so thank you for the effort that you've given for this and how it's affecting particularly our police officers across the country. And I really look forward to the next iteration with dignity and leadership, because I think it does. This concept deserves even a wider audience. And so thank you very much. It's been great to talk with you about the book, reminding me of a few things. I want to say, if you want to reach out to Marcel or to Dan, we put their emails there in the chat box. I know they would love to hear from you. And I hope that you will make use of this. I hope you'll get the book, this is one of those that you need to not just hear about this, you need to get the book. And I hope you'll do that. Thank you for being with us, gentlemen. Thank you, Lisa and Kim, for your work behind the scenes. And to all of you that have joined us, hope that you have a great day, and we will see you down the road.
Thank you, Mike. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Mike.